Hi, I'm going to continue the video with chapters 13 and 14 of Walk Two Moons. Chapter 13 is called Bouncing Berkway, and it starts on page 74. And Sal is continuing on her road trip and telling Graham and Gramps the story of things that happened to her in Euclid, Ohio, when she moved there with her dad after the mom had left them. So I'm going to pick up with page 74, Bouncing Berkway. It was time to tell Graham and Gramps about Mr. Berkway. Mr. Berkway was mighty strange. I didn't know what to make of him. I thought he might have a few squirrels in the attic of his brain. He was one of those energetic teachers who loved his subject half to death and leaped about the room dramatically, waving his arms and clutching his chest and whomping people on the back. He said, "Brilliant and wonderful and terrific." He was tall and slim, and his bushy black hair made him look wild, but he had enormous, deep brown cow-like eyes that sparkled all over the place, and when he turned these eyes on you, you felt as if his whole purpose in life was to stand there and listen to you, and you alone. Midway through the first class, Mr. Berkway asked for everyone's summer journals. He flung himself up and down the aisles, receiving the journals as if they were manna from heaven. Manna from heaven is just a way of meaning something like extremely rare, precious. "Wonderful," he said to each journal giver. I was worried. I had no journal. On top of Mary Lou Finney's desk were 6 journals. 6. Mr. Berkway said, "Heavens, mercy! Can it be Shakespeare?" He counted the journals. 6. Brilliant, magnificent. Christy and Megan, 2 girls who had their own club called the GGP, whatever that meant, were whispering over on the other side of the room and casting malevolent looks in Mary Lou's direction. Malevolent is one of your vocab words for this week. Malevolent just means evil. If you think about the character Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty, she was the villain in that. So that prefix mal, M-A-L, means bad in Latin. So a lot of words that start with that mean bad. Like if something malfunctions, it functions badly. Or malnutrition means that you don't have good nutrition. So malevolent means like wishing bad things on someone. So the 2 girls who have their own little club are basically giving Mary Lou some mean looks. Remember, Mary Lou is Phoebe and Sal's friend, and she's the one with the little brothers who were so annoying and always running around, and Ben is her cousin, and he lives at her house. Mary Lou kept her hand on top of the journals as Mr. Berkway reached for them. In a low voice, she said, "I don't want you to read them." "What?" Mr. Berkway boomed. "Not read them?" The whole room was silent. Mr. Berkway scooped up Mary Lou's journals before she could even blink. He said, "Don't be silly. Brilliant. Thank you." Another girl, Beth Ann, looked as if she might cry. Phoebe was sending me messages with her eyebrows that indicated she was not too pleased either. I think they were all hoping that Mr. Berkway was not actually going to read these journals. Mr. Berkway ran around the whole room snatching journals. Alex Cheevy's journal was covered with basketball stickers. Christy and Megan's were slathered over with pictures of male models. The cover of Ben's was a cartoon of a boy with a normal boy's head, but the arms and legs were pencils, and out of the tips of the hands and feet were dribbles of words. When he got to Phoebe's desk, Mr. Berkway lifted up her plain journal and peeked inside. Phoebe was trying to slide down in her chair. I didn't write much," Phoebe said. "In fact, I can hardly remember what I wrote about at all." By the time Mr. Berkway got to me, my heart was clobbering around so hard I thought it might leap straight out of my chest. Deprived child, he said. You didn't have a chance to write a journal. I'm new. New, how blessed, he said. There's nothing in this whole wide world that is better than a new person. So I didn't know about the journals. Not to worry, Mr. Berkway said. I'll think of something. I wasn't sure what that meant. I thought maybe he would give me a whole lot of extra homework or something. For the rest of the day, you could see little groups of people asking each other, "Did you write about me?" I was very glad I hadn't written anything. For a while, we didn't hear any more about the journals. We had absolutely no idea all the trouble they were going to cause. That's the end of chapter 13, so that's some foreshadowing, meaning a clue as to what's going to happen. And I'm sure if you think about it, if I asked you to write a journal about your life and your summer and what happened, and you wrote about some things that included people at school, you can imagine that could cause some trouble. So we're going to hear more about the journals later. We're going to move on to chapter 14, which is called the rhododendron. It starts on page 78. A rhododendron is just a type of bush with flowers on it. I put a picture of it on the lesson plans just so you can kind of visualize in your head what it looks like. Okay, so top of page 78. One Saturday, I was at Phoebe's again. Her father was golfing and her mother was running errands. Mrs. Winterbottom had read out a long list to us of where she would be in case we needed her. If we heard any noises at all, we were supposed to call the police immediately. After you call the police, Mrs. Winterbottom said, call Mrs. Cadaver. I think she's home today. I'm sure she would come right over. Oh, sure, Phoebe whispered to me. That's about the last person I would call. Phoebe imagined that every noise was the lunatic sneaking in or the message leaver creeping up to drop off another anonymous note. She was so jumpy, I began to feel uneasy too. After her mother left, Phoebe said, Mrs. Cadaver works odd hours, doesn't she? Sometimes she works every night for a week, straggling home when most people are waking up. But sometimes she works during the day. She's a nurse, so I guess she works different shifts, I said. That day, Mrs. Cadaver was home, puttering around her garden. We saw her from Phoebe's bedroom window. Actually, puttering is not the best word. What she was doing was more like slogging and slashing. Mrs. Cadaver hacked branches off of trees and hauled these to the back of her lot, where she lumped them into a pile of branches that she had hacked off last week. I told you she was as strong as an ox, Phoebe said. You notice that little simile there? This author likes to use a lot of similes. If you start looking for them, you'll notice them throughout. Next, Mrs. Cadaver slashed and sliced at a pitiful rosebush that had been trying to creep up the side of her house. Then she sheared off the tops of the hedge that borders Phoebe's yard. She moved on to a rhododendron bush, which she was poking and prodding when a car pulled into the driveway. A tall man with bushy black hair leaped out, and seeing her, he practically skipped back to where she was. They hugged each other. Oh, no, Phoebe said. The man with the bushy black hair was Mr. Berkway, our English teacher. Mrs. Cadaver pointed to the rhododendron bush and then at the axe, but Mr. Berkway shook his head. He disappeared into the garage and returned with 2 shovels. I'm at the top of page 80. Then he and Mrs. Cadaver gouged and prodded and tunneled around in the dirt until the poor old rhododendron flopped onto its side. They lugged the bush to the opposite side of the yard where there was a mound of dirt, and they replanted the bush. Maybe there's something hidden under the bush, Phoebe said. Like what? Like Mr. Cadaver, as I told you before. Maybe Mr. Berkway helped her chop up her husband and bury him, and maybe they were getting worried and decided to disguise this spot with a rhododendron bush. I must have looked skeptical. Phoebe said, Sal, you can never tell. And Sal, I don't think you or your father should go over there anymore. I certainly agreed with her on that one. Dad and I had just been there 2 nights earlier, and I'd hardly been able to sit still. I started noticing all these frightening things in Margaret's house. Creepy masks, old swords. books with titles like The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Skull and the Hatchet. Margaret cornered me in the kitchen and said, "So what has your father told you about me?" "Nothing," I said. "Oh." She seemed disappointed. My father's behavior was always different at Margaret's. At home, I would sometimes find him sitting on his bed, staring at the floor or reading through old letters or gazing at the photo album. He looked sad and lonely. But at Margaret's, he would smile and sometimes even laugh. And once she touched his hand and he let her hand rest there on top of his. I didn't like it. I didn't want my father to be sad, but at least when he was sad, I knew he was remembering my mother. So when Phoebe suggested that my father and I should not go to Margaret's, I was quite willing to agree with that notion. A notion is like an idea. When Phoebe's mother came home from running all her errands, she looked terrible. She was sniffling and blowing her nose. Phoebe said that we were going to do our homework. Upstairs, I said, maybe we should have helped her put away the groceries. She likes to do that all by herself, Phoebe said. Are you sure? Of course I'm sure, Phoebe said. I've lived here my whole life, haven't I? She looked as if she'd been crying. Maybe something is wrong. Maybe something is bothering her. Don't you think she would say so then? Maybe she's afraid to, I said. I wondered why it was so easy for me to see that Phoebe's mother was worried and miserable, but Phoebe couldn't see it, or if she could, she was ignoring it. Maybe she didn't want to notice. I'm at the top of 82. Maybe it was too frightening a thing. I wondered if this was how it had been with my mother. Were there things that I didn't notice? So I'm going to ask you to pause there and think about that. That's a pretty important part of the book. She's noticing things about Phoebe's mother that Phoebe doesn't notice, and her own mother left, and you as the reader get clues along the way of why the mom might have left. But Sal, maybe being too close to the situation, didn't see those things at the time. Later that afternoon, when Phoebe and I went downstairs, Mrs. Winterbottom was talking with Prudence. Do you think I lead a tiny life? She asked. How do you mean? Prudence said as she filed her nails. Do we have any nail polish remover? Phoebe's mother retrieved a bottle of nail polish remover from the bathroom. Oh, Prudence said, before I forget, do you think you could sew up the hem on my brown skirt so I could wear it tomorrow? Oh, please. Prudence tilted her head to the side, tugged at her hair in exactly the same way Phoebe does, and smushed up her mouth into a little pout. Doesn't Prudence know how to sew? I asked. Of course she does, Phoebe said. Why? I was just wondering why she doesn't sew her own skirt. Sal, you're becoming very critical. Before I left Phoebe's that day, Mrs. Winterbottom handed Prudence her brown skirt with a newly sewn hem, and all the way home I wondered about Mrs. Winterbottom and what she meant about living a tiny life. If she didn't like all that baking and cleaning and jumping up to get bottles of nail polish remover and sewing hems, why did she do it? Why didn't she tell them to do some of these things themselves? Maybe she was afraid there would be nothing left for her to do. There would be no need for her, and she would become invisible and no one would notice. When I got home that day, my father handed me a package. It's from Margaret, he said. What is it? I don't know. Why don't you open it? Inside was a blue sweater. I put it back in the box and went upstairs. My father followed me. Sal, do you like it? I don't want it, I said. She was just trying to. She likes you. I don't care if she likes me or not, I said. My father stood there looking around the room. I want to tell you something about Margaret, he said. Well, I don't want to hear it. I was feeling so completely ornery. When my father left the room, I could still hear my own voice saying, I don't want to hear it. I sounded exactly like Phoebe. So at the end of this chapter, there are some questions to answer. Think about a couple of things. Why does Mrs. Winterbottom, what does she mean by living a tiny life? And the dad wants to tell Sal something about Margaret. What do you think it is that he wants to tell her that Sal doesn't want to hear? Okay. I'm going to pick back up next time with chapters 15 and 16. Okay. Until then, see you later.